Hello, everyone. It's time for us to start, and it's a great pleasure on behalf of the college to welcome you all to the second Donald Russell Memorial Lecture. As most of you will already know, Donald Russell been at the very center of classics at St. John's and indeed a pillar of classics at Oxford and a foundational figure in many fields of classical study worldwide. He joined St. John's as a fellow and tutor in classics in 1948 and taught students in this college very nearly until his death in 2020, few months short of his centenary, and indeed continued active research till the very end. The last piece from his pen, a chapter very appropriately for today's topic on Plutarch's style, appeared in Cambridge Companion to Plutarch in 2023, 3 years after his death. There were some delays in publication, so his publication record stretches all the way from the 1950s to 2020s, and throughout all this time in the fields he made his own: imperial Greek literature, rhetoric, biography. He remained at the center of what scholarly conversation was about. Many of us here in the audience owe enormous deal to him personally and remember him with extreme fondness, and he was a very, very significant figure in the history of this college, the second longest tenure of fellowship in the whole history of the college, and the longest of any fellow who actually taught. It's very easy to be a fellow if you don't. It's an enormous pleasure to welcome, to give today's lecture, Professor Judith Mossman. She is an Emerita Professor of Classics at Coventry University, where she's been till very recently Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Arts and Humanities, and had an exceptionally distinguished career, getting her from Oxford to Dublin, to Nottingham, to Coventry, in the course of which she is the president of the Hellenic Society, is now chair of the Council of Classical Association. Importantly, for the kind of concerns we have in this university about making classics accessible to all, was at the forefront of pioneering classical civilization in schools, the kind of study of classics that doesn't require Latin and Greek, but of course her own research demanded an exceptional level of understanding of literature in Greek, and two fields in which we all know and admire her work. Euripides, and many of you will have used her magnificent edition of Euripides' Medea, and ancient biography, Plutarch especially. She edited or co-edited a whole series of volumes on Plutarch, and especially, I suppose, on characterization in Plutarchian biography. And today she'll speak to us on a topic which would have interested Donald very much: Plutarch Speaking Metaphorically. And without further ado, I'll pass it over to Judith.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Georgi, and thank you very much for the invitation, and thank everyone here very much for coming. If you can, get into a position where you can see a handout, that would be very advantageous. Can you hear me at the back? That's the other thing. Great, wonderful, thank you very much. So here is an image of Plutarch from the Nuremberg Chronicle. As you see, he looks worried. I think he's been thinking about metaphor, but also his lower half appears to have turned into a flower, which I think would be concerning for anyone. Now, I was both honoured and delighted to be asked to give this lecture in honour of Donald. In fact, I don't think I stopped smiling for a whole week afterwards. One could fill an entire lecture series with tales of his kindness to me as a graduate student for whom he had no special responsibility, and praise of his extraordinary scholarship and inspiring teaching. But Donald, as many of you will remember, was always a very self-effacing person, and I suspect as the founding father of modern Plutarch studies, he would prefer me to talk about the Chironean. Well, I begin with a quotation from Donald himself. No Greek prose writer comes near Plutarch in richness of metaphor and simile. This points to something fundamental in Plutarch's way of thinking. Comparison is the key. We might say he has a syncritical rather than a critical mind. Only too often, analogies altogether supplant reasoning and inference. It seems as if Plutarch never contemplates anything by itself, but always in juxtaposition with something either like or unlike it, and that he always wants to clarify his meaning by pointing out the likenesses and the unlikenesses. This tendency ends by making him something of a prose poet, a writer who could give a lot of hints to poets, both in subject matter, the heroic tales of the lives, and in the metaphorical discourse that is the essence of poetry. The reference to this is in handout number 1, and it's to the posthumous article which Georgi mentioned in his kind introduction. Donald rightly goes on to argue that Plutarch's use of quotations is part of the same syncritical tendency, and generally, Donald was probably the most sensitive exponent in the 20th and 21st centuries of the richness of the prose which results. However, I can't help feeling that Donald is perhaps being just a little hard on Plutarch here in deprecating the consequences of this syncritical frame of mind. Multiple metaphors, I would argue, may not merely be evidence of confusion of mind, and are certainly not purely ornamental, but may have a sophisticated explanatory force. Very often, Plutarch is seeking to explain phenomena which are extraordinarily complex and difficult to understand. He does so with reference to a variety of common experiences. The search for appropriate metaphor mirrors the search for the truth of the concept. The very multiplication of the metaphors can flesh out the possibilities of what he's trying to explain in productive ways, which may reach more of his readers as one metaphor strikes a chord more with one group than with another. The insight that metaphor might be more than just a literary device is one in which in the modern period can be associated most clearly with George Lakoff and Mark Johnson's path-breaking book, Metaphors We Live By. The reference into this and to a very small sample of the massive subsequent scholarship is in handout number 2. Abstract knowledge itself, it can be argued, originates in conceptual metaphors, whereby concrete knowledge based on daily experience is used to describe the abstract. The study of metaphors used to describe abstract concepts can therefore possibly tell us more about how different societies think about those concepts, as Boroditsky explored in a 2001 article on Mandarin and English speakers' respective concept of time. And this is also the rationale for the Glasgow metaphor mapping project, which is based on the historical thesaurus of English, and of the Winged Words project in Leiden, among others. These references are in handout number 3. But the instructive function of metaphor and its utility in explaining the abstract was also well understood in the ancient world. Far from being mere rhetorical flourishes, metaphors were part and parcel of philosophical discourse from at least Plato onwards, as Lakoff and Johnson make very clear. They contrast Plato and Aristotle's productive use of metaphor to produce insight with the suspicious attitude of Hobbes and Locke. As early as Aristotle, it is apparent that metaphor is not only a stylistic, but also a cognitive phenomenon of language. And I've put the relevant quotations and some discussion of them in handout number 4. I might just pause for a moment and look at the second quotation from Aristotle. It is extremely important to use in the proper place each of the kinds I have mentioned, but by far the most important is to be good at metaphor, for this is the only one that cannot be learnt from anyone else, and it is a sign of natural genius, as to be good at metaphor is to perceive resemblances. So it might perhaps function as defense of Plutarch. Plato never actually uses the word metaphora. It's not found in the rhetorical sense before Aristotle, but he does use other words for a mode of exposition which seems very similar, such as eikon, image, and paradigma, exemplar. And he certainly uses metaphors in philosophical discussion, sometimes in ways which actually swing the argument in one direction rather than another, not always towards the most obvious direction. Plutarch, too, can force his metaphors onto the reader, like a conjurer forcing a card. So throughout his work on whether the land animals are more intelligent than the sea animals, not as often read as it ought to be, it's really good, he constantly matches metaphors which compare animals with humans with metaphors which compare humans with animals. By collapsing the differences between species in this way, he loads the debate on hunting, which opens the dialogue and constitutes the most sophisticated part of it, in favour of the speaker who argues that hunting is cruel. I've discussed this work in the article on the handout number 5. This type of purposeful use of metaphor has been extensively studied recently, especially the use of metaphor in political speeches and journalistic opinion pieces and its effects on the audience or reader. Some references are in number 6 on the handout. Choice metaphors can significantly strengthen, or if badly chosen, compromise an argument. Now, metaphor has what Sebastian Matzner has called a surplus of meaning. The reference to that is in number 7 on the handout, which derives from the interaction of the terminological domains of the tenor, the concept or thing being described, also known as the target domain, and the vehicle, the language used to describe it, also known as the source domain. Because these terminologies overlap but do not entirely coincide, a metaphor can create multiple meanings, not all of them desired. Hence the Hobbesian concern about the potential for metaphor to mislead expressed in the quotation in handout 8. Although the paradoxical use of metaphor to argue in the quotation itself may well be a dry Hobbesian joke. See, he starts with light and progresses on to ignis fatui. What's light and what's not light? This slipperiness of metaphor was also stressed by Nietzsche in an 1873 essay on truth and lie in an extra-moral sense, which I've quoted in handout number 9. Both these two passages and many others, including many modern academic studies, demonstrate that one of the tricky things about metaphor is that it is impossible to discuss without resorting to, well, metaphor. And I'm sure you've noticed that I have been no exception to this rule. If one had to ring a bell every time one used a metaphor, there would be a constant clanging noise. There are some other examples of this tendency in handout number 10. There are traces of this distrustful discourse in how Plutarch himself talks about metaphor. The Greek word comes from the verb metaphero, carry across, transfer. It then comes to mean transfer a word to a new sense and by extension use metaphor. In one passage of Plutarch, metaphor represents an alternative mode of explanation to straightforward naming. Cicero, in retirement during Caesar's dictatorship, sets himself to translate all the philosophical dialogues. This is the passage in handout number 11. In translating, a word in which lurks the Latin translatio, which also means carrying across, Cicero sometimes, to use an English metaphor to which I shall return, and which we've just seen in that passage of Nietzsche too in handout 9, coins his own terms and sometimes expresses the meaning of the Greek by means of metaphor, a conceptual translation from one idea to another, rather than a verbal one. I think this very often reflects Plutarch's own practice. While metaphor at its best can adorn speech and help to make it persuasive, sometimes Plutarch hints at the potential metaphor offers for confusion. Note the conditional in a piece of the Pelopidas. If the truth may be expressed in a metaphor, he has to apologize for using metaphor. And this is a similar apologetic use of that sort of phrase in the table talk as well. And there are some other references to the pros and cons of metaphor in number 12 on the handout. As a Platonist, Plutarch can be seen both as reveling in figurative language and as profoundly mistrusting it, because it misrepresents or may misrepresent reality. When he talks about speech and language, he frequently uses metaphors to describe the nature of communication. How these metaphors work will be the subject of the rest of this lecture. In examining these metaphors, it may be useful to refer to deliberate metaphor theory, which builds on the conceptual metaphor theory developed as a result of Lakoff and Johnson's work. These references are back in handout number 2. Studies have shown that some metaphors take longer than others for readers or listeners to comprehend. Metaphors which are used deliberately as metaphors take longer than those which are not. Novel metaphors, unfamiliar ones, take longer than conventional ones. Metaphors which are signalled as such, for example, similes, also slow down the process of comprehension. Deliberate metaphor, it is argued, forces the reader or listener to pay attention to the source domain of the metaphor as well as the target domain. Now, it would not be unexpected if we found that Plutarch's literary prose contained more deliberate metaphors than non-deliberate ones, and so indeed it proves. It is only fair to say that deliberate metaphor theory has many detractors and can by no means claim to have solutions to all of the many problems which have been raised with conceptual metaphor theory. Both have been copiously criticised and with vigour. See again the works in handout number 2 and the indicative title, Metaphor Wars. For what they don't explain about metaphor, the explanations are held to be very incomplete. Problems of metaphor identification loom large. For example, what is a metaphor? What isn't? What counts? What doesn't? I think this is more of an issue in everyday discourse than in analysing Plutarch's use of metaphor, But there certainly are examples in Plutarch where it's useful to pause and consider whether a process such as the metaphor identification procedure developed by the delightfully named Prageljazz group, Prageljazz would be rather a good name for a cat, I think, maybe that procedure might be helpful. In shortened form, what you do is 1, read the text, 2, for each lexical unit, establish its meaning in context, determine whether it has a more basic meaning in other contexts than in the passage under consideration, and 3, if it has, decide whether the contextual meaning can be understood by comparison or contrast with the basic meaning. If yes, it's a metaphor. Rinse and repeat. Well, I'd like to start with an example where Plutarch, wholly self-consciously, I think, takes his own practice to extremes, a little work on talkativeness. There is an extended joke here, which depends on metaphor. Talkativeness is treated as a disease, and the text performs some of the symptoms, even as it prescribes for the disorder. He never uses one word where 3 will do in this text. Take the opening lines, it's 502b to c, translated by Donald. The passage is on the handout at number 13. And here it is on the PowerPoint. Now the words in red on the slide have straightforward medical meanings in Greek. And based on the context, I used metaphorically here. The words in green also express the medical metaphor because they're coinages whose form suggests names for pathologies. The very first word in yellow, dyskolon, is a bit harder to pin down as metaphorical, although I believe that in context it is. It has a meaning hard to please with food, or more generally, dyspeptic. It's the title of a comedy by Menander, which can be rendered as Old Cantankerous. It too then has physiological overtones. It's based on the word colon for colon, the intestine. And it's used in actual medical discourse of fevers in Hippocrates, though it is used in the general sense of troublesome rather than in any technical way to do with digestion. It is also true that the Hippocratics use metaphor copiously themselves to talk about symptoms. But in Plutarch, the word is applied to the therapy rather than the disease, which alerts the reader to a metaphor in the offing. And it is placed first in the phrase, it's troublesome and then difficult, kalapon. And that is the other way round in the pairing of the same 2 adjectives in Aristophanes, in the Wasps, and perhaps more significantly in Plato's Phaedrus, which is a little bit later on in the handout at number 15. How deliberate is this metaphor? It's sustained, which is considered a marker of deliberateness. It's humorous, which has also been suggested as a marker. The metaphor is prepared for, then starts as a conventional one, which is then made more novel by Plutarch inventing 2 words to continue it, which suggests an element of deliberation. This medical metaphor links to others. Water, flowing and flooding and tossing in a storm at sea, sound, echoing and clanging. I've tried to map this in a word cloud here. You'll see the disease metaphor is much more common than any of the others. There are other refinements. Sometimes metaphors blend with examples from real life, which come from the source domain to which the metaphor refers. So in 503a, Plutarch describes the effect of a talkative person beginning to speak at a dinner party. Then, as when before the storm the north wind lashes the sea-facing cliff, up they all get in anticipation of a rough sea and mal de mer. This man never has willing fellow guests at dinner or companions on a journey by land or sea. The metaphorical sea journey morphs into a hypothetical real one. And this movement reoccurs a little bit later in 504b as well. Well, two more passages from the same work will demonstrate the overall effect. 503 C to D and 507 A to B on the handout numbers 14 and 17. So here is 503C. Again, on the slide, I've coloured what I think are the metaphorical expressions in red. This time I've just put the Greek on the handout to save space. Fenced around and guard are both used literally in military contexts. The image as a whole has an Homeric background, which is evoked by the word used for securely, euarchos. In Homer, the expression goes, "What a word is this that has escaped the barrier of your teeth, herkos hodonton." That occurs twice in the Iliad and 6 times in the Odyssey. The Homeric image gives way to another one from Plato, this time from Phaedrus, namely reason, the charioteer, pulling on the reins of the unruly horse of the soul. And now we come to that passage in handout number 15, and you see the part in bold reflects what he thinks the teeth ought to do, so you can actually bite your tongue until it bleeds. This seems to me to be pretty clearly a reminiscence of this passage in bold on the handout in number 15. There is, however, also a Homeric twist. The phrase shining rains, hernia sigilloenta, is a Homeric expression. In a further twist, there's a clear pun on the word for shining, sigilloenta, and the word for silence, sigao, and its various cognates. Hence, I've put that word in green on the slide. A disconcerting effect of this metaphor is that it presents a picture of a divided, embodied self, reason policing the tongue, metonymic. The tongue is obviously metonymic for talkativeness, with reason's enforcers, the teeth, at the behest of personified nature. For the purposes of today, I'm treating metonymy and personification as part of the metaphorical sphere, partly for reasons of time. One can also argue about that as well. Some of the elaboration of the metaphor, I think I need to say a little more about. The word for curl up, for example, in yellow on the slide, is very rarely employed like this. And indeed, the only parallel I could find for it was in Plato's Symposium, where it's used of a person shrinking back in horror. The context then suggests that the word is being used metaphorically, and indeed that the tongue is being personified itself, just as it is by the use of the word obey and the word for disobedience, a variant of the akrateia, which Plato so often deplores. But I've put it in yellow because qua tongues can curl up quite literally. The Euripidean quotation, adapted from a couplet in the Bacchae, a comment on Pentheus' blasphemy, returns to the horse metaphor encapsulated by shining rains. There is then a shift marked by the next metaphor's source domain being laid out before the target domain, instead of the other way round, and the bridal image gives way to a more novel one, the lock and the door, a mouth that has no lock or door on it. I say more novel because, at least with the bridal metaphor, the text conjures up an object which is intended to be placed in a mouth, the mouth of a horse, not a person, but nonetheless a mouth. Locks and doors belong to a domain far removed from the target domain of speech. Perhaps there is an element of looking back to the barricade of the teeth and the guard at the start of the passage, but the metaphor is soon supplanted by another. Speech as water again, a whole sea of it, perpetually pouring outwards. It's like the Black Sea. There are other speech and speech as water metaphors throughout the work, which I've listed in handout number 16. Now, the last metaphor, when wheat is kept in a jar, and so forth, seems to move again from the volume of speech to its quality. But although there's still an underlying metaphor of a container, here what is contained is wheat rather than liquid, wheat spoiling in a jar. There is a case, I think, for grouping many of the metaphors in this work as container metaphors. There's one other expression which should be discussed. The word telos occurs twice, once rendered as end and once as goal, both in yellow. The identification of this as metaphorical is much harder than the examples we've been discussing. Telos meaning ending, as in the first example, probably isn't metaphorical. That's a basic meaning of the word in all the dictionaries. Telos as a goal, though, as the highest purpose of any particular thing, often is metaphorical, and particularly in philosophical contexts. So the second example may have a better claim to be metaphorical, though in a way which approaches a technical term, given how often the usage occurs in Plato. Again, how deliberate is all this? There is, of course, an argument that Plutarch is falling back on the resources of an excellent education. Homer, Plato, and Euripides are the big three of the educated elite under the Roman Empire. One could say that these metaphors simply pour out of him, as in like the Black Sea, because they are, to use a phrase of Martin West's, lodged in his mind like bacteria in a well. That is, of course, Martin West declining to believe in connected imagery in the Oresteia. But the way the metaphors are elaborated, and especially the pun on rains and silence, argues rather more deliberation, I think. You don't have to be a fan of authorial intention to see that the reader's metaphorical processing faculty might linger over the pun and even be slowed down by the very number of images chasing each other through this text. If this work was ever declaimed, might the performer perhaps have slowed down to allow the listener to appreciate all these metaphors? And I think it's also important to remember that Plutarch's readers, Greek and Roman, will have had similar educations and similar close knowledge of the relevant texts. Now, my final passage from this work is in handout 17, and it comes from a section where Plutarch is condemning talkativeness on the grounds that it is dangerous. Telling secret, even in the Oxford fashion of one person at a time, leads to trouble. The first metaphor is from a much more unexpected domain, that of mathematics, as the monad does not go beyond its own definition but remains one once for all, which is why it is called monad, whereas the dyad is an indefinite principle of diversity. The whole comparison between the monad and the dyad and a secret that remains secret and one which is shared is basically a metaphor. But as there are other metaphors embedded within that larger one, I haven't just coloured the whole section red. There is a further point to be made. Much modern work has been done on the importance of conceptual metaphors to mathematics. There's one reference on this with some further bibliography at the bottom of handout 17. Plutarch can be seen here as inverting the usual practice of explaining the abstract by means of the concrete, and rather as explaining something quite basic, the telling of a secret, by means of something intellectually more rarefied. There's an element of personification here in does not go beyond its own definition, literally its own boundary, and loses its identity. I'm sure that Donald was right to identify a pun on monad and the Greek root meno, translated as remains in Greek in green on the slide. Perhaps more complex is indefinite in yellow. This word has a basic meaning of without boundaries and is used of land, for example, in the first book of Thucydides. Horos, meaning boundary, here translated as definition, occurs in the preceding clause, pointing the contrast between the two entities. But its use is more frequently metaphorical, as it is here, to the point where its status as a live metaphor must be in doubt. A much more obvious metaphor, and one with a Homeric pedigree, follows. Winged words, so famous that Leiden used the phrase as the title of its project on metaphor. The phrase occurs numerous times in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. The metaphor is pretty clearly spelled out here. It's hard to catch a creature with wings once you let it out of your hands, and impossible to grasp and control a word that you have let slip from your lips. It's then rammed home and extended with the aid of another quotation, this time from Archilochus. This second quotation, it arches its swift wings, is probably from a retelling of the fable of the fox and the eagle, and represents the perfidious eagle effortlessly leaving the poor fox on the ground after killing its cubs. If so, the quotation would not only repeat the metaphor, but also imply powerless regret on the part of the speaker. Now, what about spreading? This seems to be mixing the winged metaphor with another. And interestingly, the movement from singular to plural in the monad-dyad metaphor is replicated here. The winged word is a singular entity as it escapes. This metaphor, spreading, is used of groups of things, crowds, foam or clouds of dust, scattered seeds, and so on. The word has, in fact, multiplied. The final metaphor is an extended one of the word as a ship. Notably, ships are sometimes compared with birds, the sails evoking wings, as in the first line of Euripides' Medea. So there is some connection of thought here, and the ship image connects also with the sea and water metaphors in Handout 16. But again, not all is simple. The word is the ship, but somehow the speaker is a passenger on his own ill-considered word and goes down with it when it sinks. Note also the sound, which is transferred, it seems, from the word to the hostile element which surrounds it. And just to enable a bit of visualization, there's a nice crater with 2 ships scudding along before disaster strikes. Now, if the second 2 major metaphors cannot be said here to be novel, the way they're expressed, both sustained and once again with some elaboration, suggests deliberateness. And the first metaphor is strikingly novel. Well, I'd now like to move on from on-talkativeness and focus on some other works and other source domains. Here in handout number 18 is a metaphor from grammar, the basis of elementary education in the ancient worlds. Plutarch is discussing the desirability of philosophical discussion at dinner. If there are only a few uneducated people present, then a meaningful discussion can still take place. But if the philosopher is badly outnumbered, he should just give up and join the party. The point of this metaphor is complex. It suggests both the dependence of consonants on vowels, and hence of the less learned on the more learned, but also to some extent corresponding dependence of the learned on their audience. Vowels are not that much use actually without consonants either. The letters fit together to make words, the diners fit together to make conversation. The term used for inarticulate, anarthru, basic meaning is unjointed, carries a good deal of baggage in thinking about speech, since Aristotle and the Stoics use it to distinguish animal noises from human speech. Hence, in this sentence, combined with the grammatical technical terms, it seems to elevate the uneducated, the Greek word is idiotai, from which we derive idiot, from really quite a low level to part of the mechanism of philosophical discussion. It's also striking that a metaphor from elementary language learning is being applied to adult discourse. On the one hand, that ensures instant comprehension of the metaphor by all Plutarch's readers, but perhaps on the other, it also by implication stresses the continuous learning process throughout life, which a philosophical attitude demands. Let me now consider a work which applies metaphors from other domains to the high-level discussion of a grammatical problem, or is it in fact a philosophical problem? This is the last of Plutarch's Platonic questions and demonstrates a congruence between philosophy and grammar, which may seem surprising to us. Plutarch provides an answer to the question, what was Plato's reason for saying that speech is a blend of nouns and verbs, when most people would say that there are many other parts of speech as well? The argument is set up by opposing Plato to a line of Homer containing all the parts of speech, a technique very much of the grammar schools. But Plutarch defends Plato first by the very Platonic argument that what is really important about language is whether it enunciates truth or falsehood, and for that you only need a noun and a verb. The argument continues by stressing that other parts of speech do not signify anything without a noun and or a verb, whereas a noun and a verb instantly create meaning. A preposition does not convey moral content, and it is moral content in which Plutarch is interested. A verb does. The other parts are like the groans and lamentations of the actors. Speech is a blend, like water and wine, of nouns and verbs. Other parts of speech are like salt in a dish of food and water in a barley cake. A third section, and this is the one on the slide, follows on from this, and it's also on the handout at number 19. Latin is used as a prime example of a language which functions without inessentials. Latin apparently has few prepositions. I can't say I remember it like that, but apparently this is because Greek grammarians decided that Latin prepositions were really adverbs. They were reclassified. And it doesn't have any articles, so I do remember that part. And yet the language works perfectly well. And in fact, it's now used by nearly all men. That's made this passage very famous in discourses about bilingualism in the ancient world. Again, the argument is adorned with an array of metaphors. The passage introduces a dress metaphor and reinforces the idea that apart from nouns and verbs, the other parts of speech are superfluous. What you really want are nouns without tassels, no article necessary, no tassel required. Nouns without tassels, as it were. Now, the privative form, without tassels, only occurs here, and it is a conjecture, although a certain one, I think, by the French mathematician Mézières. The manuscripts all read with tassels. Hence, I've put it in green because I think it's a new coinage. Craspada, the plural, is the usual form, are the edges or borders or fringes of a cloth, and in the New Testament is used of the tassels worn by Jews. The more common metaphorical use of the word is for the borders of a country, the foothills of a mountain, or the outskirts of an army camp. Whereas here, the basic meaning of the term is applied to the article. This then, I think, is a very novel metaphor and underlined by the new coinage. The dress metaphor, alongside a military metaphor, is continued in the description of Homer's skill. The translation cannot capture this, but the use of the word cosmos is pivotal. It's translated here as marshalling in yellow. Cosmos can mean both adornment, so relating to dress, and military discipline. The one word, therefore, acts as a bridge between two source domains. The crest on a helmet, again, combines the dress metaphor with a military twist, supremely appropriate as a metaphor used of Homeric Greek. The metaphor underlines the link with which the whole text has been forging between Homeric dialect and Latin. Now, finally, I'd like to return to those metaphors of language as currency or coin, which I mentioned earlier. Take why are the Delphic oracles no longer in verse in handout number 20 and here. The coinage metaphor, Plutarch's discussing exactly what it says on the tin. Why don't the Delphic oracles turn up in poetry anymore? And the argument is made that the use of words is like the currency of coin. Words, they have to be in current use to be effective. And thus the metaphor is used to justify the switch from verse to prose on the grounds of comprehensibility. And if you look at handout 21, you'll see some discussions of the coinage metaphor and another reference to Donald's discussion of the bit immediately before this passage. The same metaphor, the same coinage metaphor, though this time stressing the difference in coinage across space rather than across time, recurs in Oracles in Decline, this time used of whole myths and stories rather than stylistic modes. This is handout number 22, and here it is again on the slide. We have before us a mixed bowl, there's one metaphor, but above all, the foreign currency, as it were, of these notions. The one in the previous passage is quite simply expressed, but clearly marked as a metaphor. Like is pretty much a giveaway. This metaphor follows a metaphor from a dinner party, a mixing bowl full of wine, and stresses the need to test out coinage. Just again, for a bit of visualization, we've got here a crater ready to sit in the center of a group of symposiasts full of, normally, wine and water. The conversation in this work takes place in the Leschi of the Cnidians at Delphi, the dining room of the Cnidians at Delphi, a relaxed and social environment, so the crater metaphor could be seen as prompted by the setting. The foreign currency metaphor leads neatly into a narrative about an impressive hermit who lives on the shores of the Red Sea. So the foreign exchange aspect of the currency is in fact very pointed, very deliberate, one might say. Now, coinage is a metaphor which also appears in the lives, and again has slightly different effects in each case. The nature of a subject's speech can be used to delineate character. You are what you say. Phocion's, or oratorical style, is discussed at length in chapter 5 of the Phocion, and I've put parts of that on the handout number 23, and here it is on the slide. His style is rather grim, severe. Austeran is a metaphor because it has a basic meaning of bitter, of taste. But it is steeped or dyed in wisdom. We actually use the same metaphor talking about speech. It is like then a very high value coin with the most value in the smallest bulk. And the word used for bulk, onkos in yellow, is used in its basic meaning here, but it's used from Aristotle onwards of style, meaning loftiness or majesty, or in a bad sense, pomposity. Using a word from the source domain, coinage, which is also familiar from the target domain, rhetoric, seems here to intensify the contrast between the spareness of Phocian's speech and that of other orators, including Demosthenes. And this spareness is very directly linked to his virtue. So coins and words are exchanged, and they can be of small or great value. But unlike words, coins are copies of one another and can be interchangeable. Words should not be like this, and something goes wrong when they are used interchangeably. This is the point of the next coinage metaphor. The meanings of the words are eroded by their indiscriminate use. And that is exactly the metaphor used by Nietzsche in the passage I quoted in handout 9, that it's not coins anymore, it's just metal. Plutarch uses the coinage metaphor more prominently and in a way which relates the metaphor very closely to a source domain which features in the non-metaphorical world of the work, just as he did with sea journeys in On Talkativeness, in his life of Lycurgus, the Spartan lawgiver, a life which has a programmatic quality for all his lives of later Spartans. In the Lycurgus, Plutarch first focuses on speech in what I take to be a fundamental passage embedded in his description of the Spartan youth training, the agoge, at Lycurgus 19.2. And this is handout number 25. And there it is. Spartan speech, famously brief and famously direct, is compared by Plato to a javelin, and by Plutarch elsewhere, actually in On Talkativeness again, to steel. But this metaphor from coinage produces a focus on the exchange of speech, on a reciprocal culture. Speech replaces money as currency in a metaphor which underlines the stress throughout these lives on the corrupting effect of wealth. In 9.2, Lycurgus has withdrawn gold and silver coinage and forced the use of cumbersome iron as a form of wealth control. Here we've got some examples of oboloi and the relevant passage. No one suggests this to the Chancellor. She might like the idea. The metaphor that then underlines the connection which runs through the Spartan lives between economy of speech and resistance to the love of money. And I've discussed that in the article in handout 25. Now later in the Lycurgus, in chapter 25, Plutarch shows the elder Spartans talking in the dining rooms, the leskai, and says, by meeting in these, they would make suitable use of their leisure together. No remarks would be passed about anything relating to money-making or commercial dealings. Instead, the main function of the time spent thus would be to bestow some praise on good conduct or criticism on bad, in a light-hearted, humorous way, which made warning and correction easy to accept. Here, money is ousted even from speech in the ideal Spartan world. Lycurgus's introduction of iron coinage was said to be motivated by a desire for a society characterized by equality. There would be no distinction or inequality between individuals except for what censure of bad conduct and praise of good would determine. Money was intended to be replaced by the more valuable currency of speech and praise and blame. In this first biography, first in the sense of being at the head of their list of Spartan lives, Lycurgus's measures seem to have worked. But as the series of Spartan lives progresses, this utopian picture is eroded by increasing Spartan venality, along with a fading ideal of pithy, steely Spartan speech. It's not unusual in the lives to find a series of metaphors used in different ways throughout to influence the reader's view of the subject. Animal metaphors and similes work like this in the Alcibiades, and water and sea metaphors thread their way through the Pyrrhus. But this association between speech and money is exceptional in playing its part through a whole series of lives. Well, we've come a long way, if I may use a metaphor, argument as a journey, from talkativeness. And yet it could be said that all the examples here have tended in the same way. to show that ancient or modern, it's hard to communicate beyond a basic level without any kind of metaphor. And that metaphor does not only function as a prettification of text, but as a genuinely instructive feature of thought. And it's just very difficult to get away from it. As Nietzsche says elsewhere in the essay I quoted in handout 9, the drive toward the formation of metaphors is the fundamental human drive, which one cannot for a single instant dispense with in thought, for one would thereby dispense with man himself. Being a skillful and powerful writer, no one would expect Plutarch not to use metaphor. But I hope to have shown that he does not only do so to adorn his writing, to entertain, or even, pacey Donald, out of an inability to provide an analytical framework, but to fulfill what he regarded as the main purpose of speech, to persuade, to give his discourse muscle and sinew, to make the reader understand what he's getting at, to win the argument and bring the reader round to his view, whether of events or persons or problems. It is, in fact, an important weapon in his armoury of thought, and for us modern readers, a vital lifeline to his ancient audience and a window into his mind and his world. The liveliness of metaphor continues. At one of the key moments of the BBC's new series, Ludwig disparages metaphor, which he never uses. They're ridiculous. Why describe one thing by describing another? I never saw the sense in that. But it is at that precise moment that he sees the solution to the puzzle with which he has been wrestling. Plutarch and Donald would have enjoyed that. Thank you very much.